Okay, welcome. We are continuing our discussion of the history of early modern philosophy by bringing a new philosopher into the conversation. So this time around, we are going to be spending some time with John Locke, and this will be the first of a few discussions of Locke and his approach to epistemology and understanding the nature of reality, his metaphysics, that is. So here's the plan. We are going to lay out how, at first, Locke gives us a different philosophical methodology. So we are going to look at the way in which Locke is against Cartesian skepticism. We're going to take an opportunity to look back on some of the philosophers that we've spent some time thinking about, namely Descartes and Leibniz and Spinoza. These philosophers can be characterized under the broad school of thought sometimes referred to as rationalism. So we'll talk about what rationalism is and what the empiricist alternative would look like. And then we'll finish up by looking at Locke's famous argument against the existence of what he calls innate ideas. So Locke is going to lead us to believe that there are no innate ideas. Let's think about what's going on with Locke's critiques of Cartesian skepticism. We'll remember that Descartes told us that in order to gain certain knowledge that can function as a foundation in the sciences, what we ought to be doing is not give our assent to anything that we cannot be indubitably certain of. So the thought would be, you cannot believe anything unless you have what we might think of as like a demonstrative proof. But Locke takes a different approach. So let's see what Locke says here. I'm going to mark this up as we go. It will be unpardonable, as well as childish peevishness, if we undervalue the advantages of our knowledge and neglect to improve it for the ends which it was given us, because there are some things that are set out of the reach of it. So this does seem to be a bit of a dig at Descartes, where Descartes was telling us that, well, you might be able to sense perceive certain objects, but you don't have a proof that you are not dreaming, right? So it seems like Locke is saying, like, look, it seems like you'd be undervaluing your ability to learn things through sense perception simply because you can't give an irrefutable proof against, say, the evil demon hypothesis or the dreaming hypothesis. He further continues, it will be no excuse to an idle and untoward servant who would not attend his business by candlelight to plead that he does not have broad sunshine. That candle that is set up in us shines bright enough for our purposes. I think that this gives us a really interesting contrast between Locke and Descartes. They both seem to be quite cognizant of the fact that we are limited human creatures that don't know everything for certain. Descartes' approach is to say, well, we should try to rebuild things, try to get a proof that there are certain indubitably reliable processes in us. But it seems like Locke is going to say, look, maybe we should accept the fact that there are certain things we just cannot know, and that in light of that acknowledgement, we might still be impressed. The metaphor that he gives us here is the candle that is set up in us. So it's not the most light you could possibly shine on an issue. But, as he notes, we should think about not knowing everything, but we should think about trying to know as much as we need to get by in this life, as it were. So, with that in mind, Locke tells us it's our business not to know all things, but those which concern our conduct. So he's going to say, look, if we want to do good epistemology, we have to figure out what kinds of questions do we need to know the answer to in order to deal with issues related to our conduct. Now, another note that we get from Locke in the introduction to his essay concerning human understanding is a flag. He says, I'm going to use a certain term repeatedly throughout the essay. You know, the word essay for Locke doesn't just mean a short written piece, but it actually means an attempt. The term essay comes from the French, and people like Montaigne, when they said they were making essays, it's like an attempt to make their way through an idea. Now, speaking of which, Locke points out that he's going to use the term idea all over the place in his essay concerning human understanding. And he says that what we're talking about when we talk about ideas is whatever is the object of understanding when a man, or you should have said person, thinks. So, if we want to think about what's going on with ideas, he's going to say, well, think about what's passing through your mind as you think. Right, so I'm seeing some lights in the door of my office here. Well, those perceptions, what's going on in my mind, that is, for Locke, a collection of ideas. Now, we'll actually see that this idea, that this suggestion of Locke's, that ideas are the things you are conscious of, will actually play a pretty important role in his argument against innate ideas in a moment. Now, another thing, as you've gone through and begun to read Locke, you might notice that Locke is approaching some of the philosophical questions that we've been dealing with in a different style. So not only is he saying, let's try to be practical, answer philosophical questions as they are relevant to our real-life concerns, you might also just notice that he seems to do philosophy in a different style. Descartes, Leibniz, and Spinoza can be thought of as rationalists in their philosophical approaches. Now, even though Descartes and Leibniz and Spinoza disagree on many things, they can be considered rationalists according to many definitions. So they would agree in this broad sense. Here's a definition that Martinich, Alhaff, and Vaidia give us. So they say that rationalism is the view that there are some non-trivial propositions that are known not by sensation, and from which general descriptions of reality can be deduced. We notice that non-trivial propositions, we might say a trivial proposition is just a proposition that's true, but it's not telling you much. So if I tell you, for instance, that a dog is a dog, that's not going to tell you much. You don't even have to know the meaning of the word dog in that situation. But we might say that, like, dogs are mammals, or dogs are friendly. These are non-trivial propositions. Those are telling us something that we might not have known before. Now, the rationalist says there are some things that we know them not by a sensation, and which can inform our descriptions of reality. Let me just give you a couple of examples of rationalism that we've come across in the course. Descartes would say that it's a non-trivial proposition not known by sensation, and which tells us something about reality when he gives us his arguments that the mind and the body are distinct. Right? That's not just a trivial claim. It is a claim about the nature of reality, ultimately. And we should also notice that Descartes thinks that you can know that your mind is separate from your body, completely independent of sensation. So this invites us to consider an alternative approach. These philosophers, Locke is the first one we're going to spend some time with, but Hume and Berkeley are also lumped into this class of philosophers called empiricists. They are going to deny condition B from this definition of rationalism. So empiricists are often going to say there are some non-trivial propositions, and we can get some insight about the nature of reality from these propositions. But every single thing that you know about reality ultimately comes back to sensation. So here's the idea that Locke is going to get us to. He's going to tell us that all ideas come from sensation or reflection. And prior to this, we suppose the mind to be, as we say, white paper, void of characters, without any ideas. So we could think of this as the view that there is no thought prior to experience, and you couldn't know anything. So this is sometimes called like the tabula rasa view. And this view is often attributed to Locke, right? The idea that the mind is to be seen as a blank slate, right? So your mind, prior to experience, does not have anything in it. In order to have some ideas, in order to represent the world and all of the features of it, you're going to need to have some experience, right? So that is an empiricist view in the sense that if we didn't have experience, we wouldn't know anything at all. Now, the rationalist is going to tell us, on the other hand, that there are some things that we could know even if we shut out experience entirely. So, the Lockean thought, if all ideas come from sensation and reflection first, then it's a precondition for and the source of all knowledge. So we're going to learn about reality through the use of our sense organs, right? So it's through, experiencing yellowness or whiteness or hotness or coldness, hardness, softness, bitterness, sweetness. These are sensations that we have, and these are going to be the things that start chipping away at the tabula rasa. In other terms, if the mind starts as a blank slate, or as the way that Locke puts it, empty white paper, without any characters on it, well, experience is the stuff that starts writing characters, getting pictures onto the paper. So not only do we have sensation, we also have reflection. This is not only the direct sensation of the world, but we can also gain further knowledge through reflection. So thinking, doubting, believing, reasoning, knowing, and willing. This is a further source of ideas where we start to notice connections between one idea and another idea. So for instance, Locke could tell us that redness is more like orangeness than it is like blueness, right? And that would be having some sensations and then further reflecting on them. So that's going to be Locke's project. We're going to try to find ways of explaining every bit of knowledge that you've ever had in terms of either sensation or reflection. So, as we move forward, we're going to have to not only think about this empiricist project, tracing everything back to sensation or reflection. Part of what Locke is going to do in order to make his case, well, one thing that he's going to do is argue for his view that we can explain everything that we happen to know. The further thing that he's going to do is push back on a tool in the toolkit of the rationalist. So the rationalist is going to base a large part of their argument upon innate ideas. So we'll remember that the rationalist was telling us that there are some things that you know that are not known via sensation, And these philosophers will sometimes come to the view that, well, you had to have something in you already. So that would be an explanation of how you could come to know something even though you haven't had any experience. So for instance, Plato makes an argument that you can't know certain necessary truths without first knowing the basic idea that's going to get you to the necessary truths. There's a wonderful dialogue by Plato called Meno. And in Meno, we find an uneducated slave boy who is able to understand a mathematical proof just by being asked questions. So Socrates concludes from that conversation that this boy has innate ideas about necessary mathematical truths embedded in his mind. We'll also see that Descartes argues for innate ideas when he says, look, I have this idea of God in me, a most perfect being. And my idea of this most perfect being doesn't seem to be something that I learned through experience. He thinks that it isn't something that he just made up. And if it isn't either of those things, then it must be an innate idea. So what Locke is going to need to do is push back on these pictures of innate ideas that have been doing a lot of work for many versions of rationalism. We might wonder if Locke is actually arguing against every version of rationalism by arguing against innate ideas. I'll leave it for you to consider that very interesting question. Now, what is the reason to believe in innate ideas? Well, one was this Descartes argument. Well, I've got these certain kinds of ideas that I didn't just make up. And it doesn't seem like I got them through experience. Here is the innatist thesis about innate ideas that Locke is going to attack. So the innatist is going to say, there are in the understanding some primary notions stamped upon the mind of man, which the soul receives in its very first being and brings into the world with it. So the thought would be, as soon as your soul comes into existence, it has these ideas, right? So instead of having blank paper for a mind, you have some paper with some notes on it already. He seems to be using that paper metaphor still. These ideas are stamped upon the mind of man at the very start. So Locke is going to argue that these innate ideas are not necessary for knowledge. Of course, as he's thinking, men may attain all the knowledge that they have without any such original notions, that is, stamped from the origin into your mind. Here's one line of argument. Locke points out on page 295, God gave us our senses. Why would God put the idea of blueness into us as an innate idea when we could just open our eyes from infancy and start to see blue things? That seems like a non-redundant strategy. So for any sensible concept, Locke is going to say, look, the innatist thesis is going to be unnecessary. Right? Explanatorily, it is superfluous or an extra hanger-on that we don't need once we have the sense organs. God gives us our sense organs, Locke thinks. Why double things over by repeating ideas that we're just going to have in the first place? Here's the main argument. So here's the thesis, that there are these ideas stamped in your mind from the origin. Here's the main argument that Locke sees. And the argument is based on what Locke is going to call general assent. So some people might think that there are innate ideas because there are certain ideas that everybody has. All of mankind agrees on some principles, and so must necessarily be the constant impressions which the souls of men receive in their first beings. So there's the argument. right? Everybody thinks that P, therefore the idea that P is innate. So here seems to be the argument that Locke is putting on the table so he can attack it. All of humanity agrees on the proposition, and we could actually start with a conditional. If all of humanity agrees on a proposition P, then the idea that P is innate. We find this agreement, so it must be the case that this idea is innate. I'll leave it to you to think about whether there's something to that argument, but I will tell you that Locke finds it wholly unimpressive. So in chapter 1 of book 2, Locke tells us that there are a bunch of problems with this line of thought. First thing, he says, universal assent does not prove innateness. So he's going to say there are other ways to arrive at universal assent. So we might, in another sense, say innateness is not a necessary condition for universal agreement. Now, somebody might say, for instance, that everybody loves the Beatles. They're a good band. Everybody loves the Beatles. We might say that doesn't mean that love for the Beatles is innate. It could actually just be that, well, why do so many people love the Beatles? Well, it's because many people have 2 ears and a heart, as it's said. So the thought might be, we don't need an innatist explanation when an explanation that appeals to the senses will do just fine. But we might also notice that a lot of things that seem really obvious to us are not actually universally assented to. So you might have realized, as I was giving the example about people loving the Beatles, well, it's actually not the case that everybody loves the Beatles, right? There are plenty of people who don't. And we should also notice there are, in fact, some people in the world who have never heard of the Beatles. And we should also notice that some people have heard of the Beatles, but might be deaf from birth, so they've never actually listened to the Beatles. So for any particular proposition that you would claim is innate, we might say not everybody actually thinks it. So go back to Descartes' claim that God is a most perfect being, and that one of those perfections is unity or oneness. Well, not everybody believes that. Not everybody believes that God is more perfect by being a solo artist, as it were, right? Now, we might also notice that there could be some people in the world who have never thought about God as a perfect being or as a unitary being, right? There are some things that, arguably have to be true. Certain mathematical theorems. So you might actually realize that it's a necessary truth that the Pythagorean theorem is true, that for a right triangle, the shorter sides squared will equal the hypotenuse, the longest side square in a right triangle. Now, it's not as if everybody has actually thought about the Pythagorean theorem and realizes that it is a necessary truth. So Locke is going to say straight away there, this universal assent that the innatist is arguing for doesn't actually exist. So Locke actually can critique premise 1 by saying, look, we don't get to infer innate ideas from universal agreement. And 2, he's going to point out that when it comes to certain propositions, you actually can't find that many propositions that everybody agrees on. He specifically points out that children and idiots will not recognize the necessity of necessary truths. So, my 4-year-old nephew has, I don't think, like he's into number blocks, but I'm not sure that he's already gotten to the Pythagorean theorem and sees that it has to be true. And Locke uses the term idiots. I think that what Locke is referring to is people with cognitive disabilities, as we think of them now. Or maybe people who just don't spend the time learning about mathematics. In either case, he's going to point out that there are plenty of people who reach adulthood and who maybe never think about necessary truths. Now, notice that some defenders of the innatist thesis are going to tell us that, for instance, well, it's not that you have the idea directly in your mind, but you have a capacity, right? You have a capacity to realize the necessity of the Pythagorean theorem's truth. Fair enough, Locke might say. But this actually comes back to Locke's definition of what an idea is, right? An idea for Locke is that which is present to the mind when it thinks. A capacity is not something present to the mind when it thinks. He says, if you claimed that the capacity to know the necessity of the Pythagorean theorem is an innate idea, then he's going to say, well, on those terms, you know the truth of every innate or every necessary truth innately. But we don't want to confuse a capacity with an idea. And we should notice that in that case, you would have innate ideas that you've never entertained in your mind ever. And to Locke, that's just incoherent. It's a contradiction to talk about an idea that's unthought. In other terms, Locke is going to say every idea you have must be present to the mind. Right? So, as we put it here, the faculty of reason might be innate. True enough. This is why I can do mathematics and my dog cannot. I have faculty for certain kinds of reasons and to recognize certain reasons and do certain kinds of reasoning that are just inaccessible to my dog. But we might say these differences in faculties, we don't have to say that I have innate ideas that my dog doesn't have, because there are some necessary truths that I might infer someday that I do not know yet. And this is something that the capacity-based innatist argument just cannot explain. Locke also points out that there are many truths that we might refer to as self-evident truths. Examples of self-evident truths Locke considers are some of them like almost grammatical in their character. So he says like an example of a self-evident truth might be something like, whatever is, right? A thing cannot both be and not be. It's got to be on one side of that dichotomy. Or two things cannot be in the same place at the same time. Not exactly. He also says, and it's not just these sorts of like, almost like verbal claims, but he says it's also a self-evident truth that black is not white, or that yellow is more like orange than it is like blue. Here, we'd be saying that these are experience-based, right? But even though they're experience-based, they are self-evident. Things that are like obviously true as soon as you start thinking about them. On those grounds, he's going to say even noticing that there are some things that have to be true, that doesn't need to be innate. Now, here's a possible objection. I've taught Locke on innate ideas a few times, and I think that this is the most important objection in terms of prevalence and also I think philosophical importance that I hear from students. And This is the objection that there are many capacities of human beings that seem innate. So it's been pointed out, for instance, that we have language acquisition capacities. There seems to be something innate about the way humans are able to learn languages and develop them very quickly. We might also point out, this is why my 4-year-old nephew has a great many capacities for language, whereas my dog maybe can hear and respond to a few commands, but does not understand complex grammar. So we might say that language acquisition is innate. You might also think about all the sorts of reflexes. Here's my favorite example of what seems to be a very interesting innate reflex, and it's the Moro reflex in babies. So if you're holding a baby like this, and the head is up here, and the butt is down here, and you take the baby and you tilt it backwards quickly, doctors will test this. If you tilt a baby backwards very quickly, it will throw its arms out, right? It will sort of stiffen up and throw its arms backwards. And basically this is a really cool reflex that's built into us innately that helps us to not break our spines if we are dropped or have massive head injuries. The Moro reflex is probably something that we evolved as a way of protecting our bodies as infants. So we might say, isn't that proof that Locke's blank slate theory is false? Here's something that Locke says in, I believe it's chapter 3 of book 1, on 302 of the Lascano and Shapiro edition. Locke says, "I deny not that there are natural tendencies imprinted on the minds of men, and that from the very first instances of sense and perception, there are some things that are grateful." I'm pretty sure that what Locke means there is there are some tendencies in us that it's good that they're just built right into us, right? Maybe a few of us wouldn't be here if we didn't have, say, the Moro reflex built right into us. But Locke then continues, if there were certain characters imprinted by nature on the understanding, so not just tendencies, natural tendencies in our minds, but that these tendencies get into our understanding and our thoughts. Basically what Locke is asking here is, do we attribute knowledge to babies when they demonstrate their capacity for the Moro reflex? Here's what Locke points out. If there were certain characters imprinted by nature on the understanding as the principles of knowledge, he says, we don't perceive this constantly operating in us and influencing our knowledge. So it seems like what Locke is saying is look, you might have certain reflexes, and we don't just have to talk about the Moro reflex, right? We can also talk about that one where if you go to the doctor's office, let this finger represent your leg or a knee, and the doctor taps you on the shin right below the knee. It's normal for your leg to sort of straighten out and kick forward. It's not as if that is explained by a thought in your head that's saying, yes, now I am going to do that thing where I move my leg forward after being bumped on the knee. You don't have that thought running through your head all the time, and nor when your reflexes actually do their job, it's not through the functioning of a conscious idea. These reflexes just happen to us, right, without any conscious thought. And this is going to be an issue for Locke because Locke is going to tell us that the notion of an unconscious idea is contradictory, right? That would be like talking about an immaterial extended object or an immaterial thing with weight and shape, right? That just seems like a contradiction in terms. So Locke is going to say, yes, it is the case that we have certain kinds of reflexes, but those reflexes are best not understood as innate ideas. So our reflexes don't function through awareness, and something that we're not conscious of should not be called an idea. So our innate tendencies and reflexes need not be referred to as innate ideas. It might be some kind of innate tendency, but it's not an innate idea. So that's sort of like how we work our way through Locke's way of understanding the world. I suppose the challenge will be twofold. One is we can ask Locke if this universal assent argument should be the main argument for innate ideas, or is there a better argument out there for innate ideas? We'll be considering that when we look back to Leibniz in a little while. The other thing is, if we're going to treat the mind as white paper void of characters and without ideas, can we explain everything that we know on the basis of experience? So our sense organs and our capacity to reflect, is that the entirety of what we need to explain everything we know as human beings? So with that in mind, we'll stop here for now, and we will pick up next time by considering Leibniz's objections to Locke.